All right, so I think that let me start by welcoming Professor Mauricio de Rosa from Universidad de la República in Uruguay, who has been doing very interesting work with his co-authors on wealth inequality in Latin America. This is also part of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Inequality Review Project, and we're delighted to have Mauricio on board. Many thanks to join us for joining us, and the floor is yours. I think that you can handle it the way you, whichever way you prefer, whether you want people to ask questions while you're presenting or you want to wait for them to wait until the end. It's up to you, Mauricio. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nora and Ludovico, and all the rest of you for being here. Yeah, I think it's best if you have some questions, you can interrupt me. I think it'd be better that way. So it's more.
They can raise their hand, right?
Yeah, sure.
Zoom, yeah.
I'm not sure if I can see everyone. So if you raise your hands and I don't see you, please go ahead and speak out so that I can answer your questions. Otherwise, we can have some minutes in the end. So yeah, this is one of the chapters of the Latin American and the Caribbean Inequality report. This is about wealth distribution in Latin America. This is joint work with Rafael Carranza and Ignacio Flores. And basically, what we want to do here, this is one of the first chapters of the review, is to provide an overview of the state of the art in wealth distribution in the region. This, of course, is, as you may imagine, is massively important. It is important by itself. It is wealth distribution is an important subject, but it's also really important because it is very profoundly linked with personal income distribution, especially since it determines capital incomes, which are very important, especially at the top of the distribution, but also because it is linked with the functional income distribution, with the distribution of income between capital and labor at the aggregate level. So wealth inequality is of paramount importance, and also because it is linked to other important issues, especially the issue of power and the distribution of power in societies. This has been highlighted by people such as, I don't know, Thomas Piketty, Anthony Atkinson, especially. He has been very emphatic about this. But also, if you go back in time, you can find things in, I don't know, Adam Smith about the connection between wealth and power. Actually, there's a beautiful phrase by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He says, wealth, as Mr. Hobbes says, is power. And then he goes on to explain why wealth is a source of power, especially power to command other people's labors. So yeah, so this is a very important subject, but it is a subject for which we have very little evidence, and we know very little about, especially in Latin America. Not only in Latin America, but this is a region in which we have very little data about this. And we talked in the paper about something like the paradox of data abundance, because some organizations do produce detailed and quite frequent estimates of wealth inequality, for instance, for the entire region. So if you go to, I don't know, Credit Suisse or the World Inequality Lab, you will find estimates of wealth distribution, sometimes very detailed estimates, not only Gini indices, but top 1%, top 0.1%, top 10% shares for every single country in the region. And so this may give you a sense that we know a lot about wealth distribution in the region, but actually we don't. Most of these estimates are based on regressions, based on other, for instance, based on income inequality and the relationship between income and wealth inequality that we know exists based on other countries, especially European countries. So these estimates are problematic in a way, and we should be aware of this and read them with extreme caution, because actually when you go to the raw data, there's very little evidence. So in this paper, what we try to do is, well, try to understand the different data sources, what they can tell us, and what we can say about wealth distribution in the region. So basically, we try to answer two basic questions: how much wealth is there, and how is it distributed across households, individuals. The spoiler is that it is not possible to answer this question yet. I would love this to be a paper with a question, an interesting question, and some fancy methodology and some striking results with a plot twist in the end. But it is not. This is a paper in which we try to say, well, this is what we know, and this is what we have, and this is what we can say about wealth distribution. So in a way, we will try to make sense of some contradicting statistics. It's like a database of databases. In a way, it's similar to what Nora, Chico, Facundo, and François did for income inequality, but in this case for wealth inequality with much less data and papers. We'll try to see some official estimates based on some surveys that we have. I'm going to talk to you about this in a minute. Some data from national accounts. These global data sets like the World Inequality Lab, the Credit Suisse, Forbes, and then some also review some of the research papers that are around. Some who focus on historical evidence, and some which are more recent. And we also will provide some new estimates. So basically, this is a preview of the results that I'm going to show you. We will distinguish some solid facts, especially regarding Chile, Colombia, Uruguay, Mexico, and Brazil. Basically, in terms of the amount of wealth there is, we will find that the wealth to income ratio, so the usual way in which we express the amount of wealth in an economy is how many times the national income, or the GDP, let's say. It's not the same, but for now it's good to think about it in those terms. How many times the GDP is the national wealth? So if you say that the national wealth to income ratio is 300%, it's because the stock of wealth of the economy is 3 times larger than the GDP. So we find that for most of these countries, the wealth to income ratio is about 300%, so it's 3 times larger than GDP, and it's been increasing. We also find that there are positive values of public wealth, which is it's strange because for most developed countries, actually public wealth, the wealth owned by the public sector is 0 or even negative because of the large, because of the massive amount of debt that these governments have. Then the Tobin's Q, which is this relationship between the book value and the market value of wealth, is particularly low in Latin America. I'm going to talk to you about that in a minute. This is about aggregate wealth. In terms of inequality, we'll find high inequality, not the highest in the world. There are some countries also like not poor countries, or at least not developed countries such as South Africa, which have larger concentration of wealth. But we will find very high inequality. To fix ideas is what we find based on some high quality admin data, that the top 1% has approximately 40% of total wealth for some countries. And then other sources such as surveys, which are bad for many things, but very good for others, will tell us about what's going on with the rest of the distribution. And especially, we'll find that for most of the countries for which we have information, the bottom half of the distribution has practically no wealth. In some cases, wealth is even negative, because you have to remember that unlike income, you can have negative wealth because you can have more liabilities than assets. And that's what happens many times in the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution. And then we'll have some conjectures. We'll discuss. I'm not going to discuss this in this presentation, but the wealth inequality is probably high in other countries too. This is based on capital incomes data, which is not the same as wealth inequality. But since capital incomes are flow from wealth, then you can say some things about wealth distribution based on capital incomes data. And then there are some things that are just speculations. we think that we cannot say anything meaningful yet about trends in wealth inequality. Our educated guess would be that it's kind of stable. It's been stable in the past 20 years, but we are not sure. This is just a speculation. So we'll try to distinguish, what we know, what we think it's likely, and what we think it's only a matter of speculation. So this is what we're going to do in this presentation. Do you have any questions? Something that you want to ask, or? Okay. So the literature. There's been an explosion in papers about wealth inequality in the past 5-10 years. Many for developed countries, especially for the USA, in which there's a heated debate about the level of wealth inequality, but also the trends. But this is also the case for the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Switzerland, and the whole of Europe. There are a number of papers which address this question about what is the level of wealth inequality in those countries and regions, but very, very few for developing countries. There's one paper for South Africa that I know of, one for China, Russia. Well, China and Russia, if you can, I don't know, it's difficult to classify them, but at least they are not from the US or Europe. And there are some papers for Latin America. This paper by Gandelman and Schuberas is a paper from the exclusively on surveys, so it's different from the other papers, but it's very nice. I highly recommend that you read it. And this is especially the lack of papers for our region is the direct result of the fact that we don't have enough data to address these questions, because we have very few surveys. There are very few countries with admin data. The national accounts are very weak, and as you can imagine, that prevents us from writing more papers about this. So let's just talk 1 minute about the definition of wealth, so that we are all on the same page here. Let me just say to begin with that the wealth and capital are extremely controversial definitions. Okay, I recommend this paper out by Cohen and Harcourt about the definition of capital and the controversies around the definition of capital. This is a fantastic paper. But just let me say that there's been, in the past 200 years, there's been a lot of discussion and at least 3 major controversies about what capital is and how to measure it. So it is not a straightforward thing to define. Here in this presentation, in this paper, we use the current accounting definition of wealth, which is based on national accounts. This Piketty and Stuckmann is a chapter of a handbook on income and wealth inequality, which is very, very good. And basically, what we'll say is that the wealth is assets minus liabilities of an individual or institution. And this includes housing assets, business assets, financial assets. So all non-financial assets and financial assets minus liabilities. And this is your net wealth, the net wealth that a person or a country or an institutional sector may have. But this is purely an accounting definition of what wealth is. We do not include, in principle, but some definitions do include this, but you have to be always careful about what is included and what is not. We do not include durable goods. We do not include social security, like future payments. We do include pensions, wealth, in the definition of wealth, but the entitlement of future payments by social security systems is not included. And very importantly, human capital is not included. And there's a lot of discussion about this, but mainly this is because you cannot buy or sell your human capital. So it's not something that you can turn into income like right away. So this is one of the main reasons why human capital is not included in definitions of capital. Yeah,
Mauricio, may I ask you a question about the future pensions are included? What you mean, the investment in pension systems, not the flow?
Yeah, the amount of income or wealth that you have in your personal account.
Accumulated in your I mean, if you have a pension program with in the countries in which they have the individualized accounts, or where you have a private, that's what you include, right?
Exactly. Those are included, if you have a system that is public and is like the system in which workers, like today's workers, pay for the pensions of today's elderly. So in those cases, those incomes are not included in the wealth because it's.
I mean, essentially, you treat it as savings, and savings are included.
Exactly that. Yeah. Besides this, there's a number of dimensions that you can consider. There's different definitions of the unit of analysis, the evaluation method. Maybe I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but I don't know, it's kind of boring, so maybe not. And also the geographical reference. Is it the resident's wealth? Is the wealth within the country? Do you include tax havens or not? So there are a number of things that you have to be careful when you consider the definition of wealth that you're studying. So let's begin by discuss a little bit before going to wealth inequality about wealth aggregates, right? And first of all, let me just say, why it matters. Why, if we are interested in wealth distribution, why should we start by studying wealth aggregates? And this is basically because not doing it is not knowing what is the level of aggregate wealth. It's like not knowing what is the GDP of a country. You can do income inequality studies or papers without knowing what the GDP is, but it's kind of strange. You need to know how the economy is going in order to make sense of what is going on with inequality, because growth, for instance, and income inequality are linked in a very complex way. So you need to know what's going on with the GDP if you're talking about income, and strictly from a distributional perspective, you need to be able to quantify how much you ignore. For instance, if you have a wealth survey, you need to be able to know if that survey is accounting for 80% of aggregate wealth, 50% of aggregate wealth, or 20% of aggregate wealth. You need to know how much you ignore about in your sources. So that's why you need to have a sense at least of how much wealth there is around. So national wealth, the aggregate wealth of a country, can be seen in two different definitions. Once you can have private wealth plus public wealth. So that's one simple way to divide the aggregate non-financial, financial minus liabilities assets of a country. And the other way is to differentiate between domestic capital and the net foreign assets position. This second definition is essentially, and it is important because it is a nice introduction to how to think about wealth. You have to remember that within a country, if you have a financial asset, is the liability of another agent within that country. So it cancels out when you try to estimate the aggregate level of wealth. So in the end, for all the assets and liabilities that are within the country, they all cancel out. So the aggregate level of wealth in the end is only the non-financial part, because I insist, financial assets of one agent are the liabilities of another, so they cancel out. So in the end, the aggregate level of wealth is only the non-financial assets, so that is the domestic capital, plus the net foreign assets position of the country. So the level of assets minus liabilities that the country has as a whole with respect to the rest of the world, right? So these are two ways of looking at aggregate wealth. I'm going to go fast here, but there are very few countries with what we call the balance sheet, which is the name that the national accounts give to the part of the national accounts system that deals with wealth. The only country which has full and high quality data on wealth aggregates, it's Mexico. And data is really good for the Mexican case. For Brazil, there is some, for Colombia, some, also for Chile, and then some financial and surveyed assets are available for the countries, but these are not very useful to get a sense of the aggregate level of wealth. So basically, what we did in this paper is try to fill in the gaps, try to get as many aggregate wealth estimates for as many countries as we could, following as strictly as we could the national accounts system definition. And this is basically the result, and this is the 300% that I was talking to you about some minutes ago. So in these three lines, they are for Chile, Brazil, and Mexico. This is the market value of wealth. So is the aggregate level of wealth measured in market values. So we only have that for these three countries, and so it at the beginning of the 21st century, it was kind of 200%. So the stock of wealth was twice as large as the GDP, as the national income. It is now closer to 300%, and it is rising. This is also the case for another definition of wealth inequality, of wealth aggregates. I'm sorry, just the book value definition of wealth, which is basically instead of valuing the corporate sector as measured by the market, it is valued as it's measured in their books. That is why it's called the book value definition of our aggregate wealth. This may be higher or lower than the market value. The difference, the ratio between two is given by the Tobin's Q. This is kind of complicated, so I'm not going to go there now. But what we know is that the market value of aggregate wealth is around 300% and is growing, and that is also the case for the book value, also for the case of Mexico, and the other line is for the case of Uruguay, for which we only have the book value, and it's also growing at level from around 400% to 500%. These estimates are lower than what you find in developed countries. They usually have a market value aggregate wealth of around 500%, and sometimes it's higher, 600%, 700%. And this is something that we didn't know until recently, the amount of wealth that was in developed countries. There's a very important paper by Piketty and Sukman in QJE 2014, which is called Capital is Back, and it's about wealth to income ratios, and it's a very, very important paper. Yeah, this is the one that is cited there. So anyway, this is the two openings of the aggregate wealth, the public and private, and the capital and net foreign asset position. Just a couple of things. At least in Mexico and Uruguay, public wealth is positive and kind of high, which is not the case in developed countries. In developed countries, public wealth is usually zero or even negative. And also, the domestic capital of part of the aggregate wealth is largest by far. Actually, in most of Latin America, the net foreign asset position is negative because there are more foreign assets in our country than what we have in the rest of the world. In the north is the exact opposite. If you look at the US or Europe, their net foreign asset position is positive because they have more assets abroad than what the rest of the world has within their borders. And also, when you look at the estimates from, for example, the World Inequality Database, there you also, these are all imputations based on number of methods. There you have the paper by Baulus et al. By 2021, which describes them. But basically, you find the same upward trend in wealth inequality for most of the region. So that's something that we can say. Well, the aggregate amount of wealth is increasing in the region as a whole. So that gives us a sense of what is going on with aggregate wealth in at least in some of these Latin American countries. Now let's go to what we are more interested in, which is the net wealth inequality. So not aggregate wealth, but its distribution. Let me just take 1 minute to discuss with you some of the main empirical strategies that we have to estimate wealth distribution, because they are going to be important to understand the differences between some of the estimates. We could spend an entire class, 2, 3, 4 hours discussing these methods, because they all have some things that that are interesting and that we should discuss, but we don't have time. So I'm going to just say a couple of things about each. There you have a couple of papers that you can read that discuss them in depth, and then they're really good. So basically, to understand and to estimate what is the extent of wealth inequality in a country, you can do a number of things. The first thing you can do is go ask people, and go ask the households how how much wealth they have, and then estimate wealth distribution. This is what the wealth surveys do. In Europe and the United States, you have wealth surveys since the 1980s, and they're really good. Some, especially the wealth survey of the United States, is really good. It's quite accurate, even for the top distribution. I'm going to talk to you about this in a minute, but we only have 4 surveys for Latin America, for Colombia, Chile, Uruguay, and Mexico. And in case of Uruguay and Mexico, only for 1 year, so we don't have a lot, but at least it is something. So this is the first method, wealth surveys. What you can also do is you can estimate wealth inequality based directly on information from wealth taxes. If you have a country where there is a wealth tax, you can use that data to try to estimate what's the underlying wealth for which people pay their wealth tax. This is an interesting way to go, because it is admin data, so it's usually high quality, but very few countries have wealth taxes. They usually tax a very small number of people, usually 0.2, 0.3, 0.4% of the adult population, so very few individuals. And a lot of assets are exempted from paying taxes. So this is a kind of a weak data source, but it is very important. What you can do with this, you cannot calculate, estimate a Gini index with this, because you don't have a tiny portion of the population. You can at most estimate what is the wealth of the top 0.1% of the population, or the top 1% of the population. But anyways, this is a very useful and something that has been used in all the literature of wealth distribution, both in Latin America and also in the rest of the world. Another method that is very important is and it's gaining traction recently, is the capitalization method. Basically, here what we do is since you do not observe the level of wealth, the amount of wealth that each individual has, but you may observe their capital incomes based, say, on admin data, tax data, high quality tax data. You have the capital incomes of the whole population. If you have their capital incomes, and you know what is the rate of return of each kind of assets, of each kind of asset in every individual's wealth, then you can estimate what is the underlying wealth based on these capital incomes and the rate of return, because you can multiply these capital incomes by the inverse of the rate of return, so you can get the amount of wealth each individual has. This has a number of assumptions which are quite strong, but this is a very useful method to estimate wealth inequality, and also because sometimes it allows you to compute the distribution of wealth for the whole population. Then you have the estate multiplier method. This is very used around the world. Has not been very used in Latin America, but essentially what you do here is if you have a state tax or an inheritance tax, more generally, if you have that in your country, so when a person dies, you can measure his or her wealth at that moment. So if you consider as a sample of the whole population, the people who died in each year, and you multiply their wealth by the inverse of the probability of having deceased, of having passed away, so that way you can estimate the distribution of wealth for the whole population, right? Did you understand that? In a way, when you have a sample, the weights are given by the inverse of the probability of falling into that sample. So the weights in this sample is the inverse of the mortality rate of that kind of individual. So let's say a man between 50 and 55 with tertiary education. So if you multiply his wealth by the inverse of his mortality rate, you can get the distribution of wealth for the entire population, not only for the dead. So this is very used. Also, you can use the rich lists, the Forbes billionaires list, the Sunday Times, for in the case of UK. There are a number of billionaires lists all around. And these lists are built based on research by journalists. but they're very accurate, actually. When you compare what happens with the very, very top of the distribution with what this, I don't know, the Forbes billionaires lists tell you, they are quite accurate, actually. So this is a very useful source of information. And then there are some methods that which combine different approaches. And so these are basically the methods that you have to study wealth distribution. None of these methods or the data sources are perfect. There's none of them which is inherently superior to the rest. So especially at this point, you should always have more than one method to try to understand what's going on in terms of wealth distribution. So basically, in the paper, what we do is we do two things. First, we survey all the evidence, the papers that we have for the post-colonial wealth inequality, especially what happened with the wealth inequality in the 18th and 19th century. And then we survey the recent estimates that we have based on Alvin data, survey data, and all these global inequality estimates, World Inequality Lab, Credit Suisse, and so on. So let me just say a couple of things about the post-colonial literature. This literature is very interesting. If you're interested in economic history, I highly recommend that you read some of these papers. These are really, really good. For the most part, these are papers which focus on some regions. For instance, Rio de Janeiro or Buenos Aires or Montevideo. They are not studies for the whole country because data does not allow that. But these are very interesting anyway. There are also some studies for whole countries, for the case of Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, and Jamaica also. Usually the data sources that they use is the census, the private inventories or tax records. These inventories are very useful because they basically, it was a very common practice to have a full statement of the assets and a wealthy individual had at the time of death. So these are data sources that are very used to try to understand the concentration of wealth in the post-colonial period. Also because they had all the land that they held, the slaves, the cattle, properties. So it is very, very useful. Most of these studies also focus on a single asset, I don't know, land or cattle or slaves even. So they do not account for the whole distribution of wealth, but I insist they are very, very interesting. Anyway, some of them do analyze the whole of the distribution of across all assets. These are two papers. This one is for Montevideo. And I know this paper very well, de Moraes et al. This is really, really interesting. And they use these probate inventories and the state multiplier method, in a sense, to understand the wealth distribution of Montevideo at the turn of the 19th century. So overall, what all of this literature tells us is that wealth inequality was at least as high in the 18th, 19th century as it is today. So Gini indices sometimes are as low as 0.6, but usually you find Gini indices of around 0.8, which is kind of the same as we find nowadays. So these estimates, although very, 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 very imperfect, they do point at very high inequality. You know, a Gini index of 0.8 is very, very high, but it's not higher than what we find in our more recent estimates. Are there any questions? Something that you want to ask or comment? No. So I'll continue. And what about the last few years, last few decades? So we do a number of things in the paper. You can check that in the paper itself. Today I'm going to discuss some of those things. Basically, we divide the evidence in various ways, but one way to divide it is the evidence from the top of the distribution, the evidence for the whole of the distribution, and then some of the evidence for the very, very, very top of the distribution. So, and this is depending on the data sources that we use to study each of them. So let's begin by the evidence from the top. not the very, very, very top, but the top of the distribution, so the top 1%. So basically here you find in panel A the share of the top 1% of distribution for Uruguay, Colombia, and Chile based on admin data, right? So one thing that we find in these papers, this is the estimate in Colombia is this paper by Julián Londoño, which is a fantastic paper. Then the estimate for Chile is something that was done when they were writing a proposal for a wealth tax, so they did some wealth inequality estimates based on admin data provided by the central bank. And in this case, this is a paper that I wrote based on capital incomes admin data, capitalized in the sense of the capitalization method that I discussed some minutes ago. This is all based on admin data. So for all these three countries, what we find is that the top 1% it is approximately 40%, has approximately 40% of aggregate wealth, of total wealth of the country. So the top 1% of the distribution has 40% of total wealth. This is a lot. This is a very, very high concentration of wealth. This is close to what you find in the United States. It's lower than what you find, for instance, in South Africa, which is over 50%, 52, 53, I think. But it's much, much higher than what you find in France or the UK, where it's 20, 25% of the total wealth, right? And it is also much higher than what you find in income. In income distribution, the top 1% has 15, 20% of total income, also in admin data. In wealth, the concentration is much, much, much higher. Let me say that these are the estimates that we trust the most because they are based on very high quality data, but they have many, many problems, and they are not strictly comparable because even though they're based on admin data, the methods are not the same. We discuss in the paper some of their differences, but they are still, in our view, some of the best estimates that we have so far. If you do the same thing, the top 1% by the surveys, the wealth surveys, I'm going to say something a little bit more about the surveys in a minute, but just for now, if you look at Uruguay, Colombia, Mexico, and Chile, what you'll find is first, the top 1% is much, much lower, which is something that you would expect because usually surveys provide lower concentration of income and wealth than admin data. But it's much lower. If you look at Chile, for instance, the top 1% share is 15, 16, 17%, which is unbelievably low. You wouldn't expect that even for income in the case of Chile. So it's very, very low. But also for Uruguay, Mexico, very low estimates for it will be like in the case of Mexico had the same wealth distribution as France, which is something that you would not expect at first. But also, at least for one of the countries for which we have many data points, which is Colombia, you can see that it's quite unstable. It's very jumpy, the estimate. So this tells us that studying the top 1% with the surveys may be not the best idea in the world because you know for a fact that it is probably very low. And it also can be potentially very, very unstable, the estimates, as in the case of Colombia, which you cannot make sense of what's going on based on this data because it is all over the place. Questions? So what about the estimates that I mentioned at the beginning? You know, if you go to World Inequality Lab or the Credit Suisse, you will find top 1% shares for every country. But how reliable are they? And the answer is that we don't know because, take Chile, for instance. This is the same admin data in panel A and panel B is all the CS. CS is the Credit Suisse, and we this for the World Inequality Lab. You can see that these estimates, the levels of inequality are very different for what you can find with admin data, but also the trends are very different. If you compare Chile and the Credit Suisse and the World Inequality Lab estimates, what is going on with wealth inequality? Beyond the level of wealth inequality, what is going on with the trend? Is it growing? Is it stable? Is it declining? We don't know. And this happens with all the estimates of this sort. They are very, very heterogeneous, and the trends especially are incomprehensible.
Mauricio,
Yeah.
on the global estimates, you have Chile twice. It's hard to read for me here, but you
Oh,
have
I'm sorry.
Chile twice. No, it's not your problem. It's mine. Twice Chile, right? And twice Mexico, I think.
Mexico.
The top series is what source, and the bottom is what source. I'm not totally sure.
Usually the ones for Chile and Mexico, the World Inequality Lab provides higher wealth inequality estimates than Credit Suisse. In Colombia, it's the other way around.
Which one is it? The top one?
The top one is the World Inequality Lab. So for Chile, it would be over 45%.
With World, right?
With World, yeah.
Yeah, right. Which the students have heard about it because I mentioned it last week. So, and the bottom is Credit Suisse.
Yeah, Credit Suisse.
They're so different.
Yeah, and here this is just a sample. In the paper, you'll find more, and sometimes it's really all over the place. Because the thing is that these estimates, they're mainly, especially the ones for the World Inequality Lab, they're mainly designed to provide an estimate of global inequality. So the wealth inequality around citizens of the world. So to compare the wealth of the French and the Americans and the people from South Africa, from Uruguay, and from Indonesia. So in a way, they are not. The intention is not to provide an accurate estimate of what's going on with wealth distribution in Colombia, but rather to say, well, this is the level of wealth inequality in Latin America, and this is the population, so we can say this and that about the global wealth inequality. So that if you zoom in, you will find very messy estimates, because usually what they try to do is to provide this aggregate trends on wealth
But if
inequality.
I may ask you that, I know that we don't have that much time, but I know what well, I think I know what With World does. It's based on national accounts, I guess, primarily, right?
It is actually it is not entirely clear. For the With World, it's more clear than for the Credit Suisse. But basically, what they do is, for the countries that they have survey and billionaires list data, they correct the surveys using the billionaires list, and then they scale up to national accounts.
The wealth surveys, you mean?
Yes, the wealth service. But this is only for a handful of cases. For all of the rest, what they do is they take the income distribution, based mostly also on income surveys, and based on the relationship that there is between income inequality and wealth inequality, let's say on European countries, they impute the wealth distribution of each of those countries.
So some of these data points can be imputed rather than generated.
Most of these data points are imputed.
Okay. And what does Credit Suisse do?
It's very, very similar. There's a nice paper by Shorrocks and Davies in, I think it's the Journal of Economic Inequality, 2017, where they discuss a little bit more what they do in these estimates. But this is basically it. They impute a lot of these data points.
And has anybody tried to understand the causes of why they're so different?
I'm sorry?
The causes underlying the difference. Do we have no, not yet. Okay.
It is difficult because we don't know the details of the adjustments, so it is hard to say. What we can say is that they are providing very heterogeneous results, and we should be at least careful when we use them. I don't know. Sometimes macroeconomists ask me, can I use this or that data source to run a regression? And I say, yes, but be extremely careful, because you know that those parameters could be quite biased. So this is for the top 1%, right? What about the rest of the distribution? So for the rest of the distribution, what we can do is only look at the surveys, basically. This is what the best we can do. And we have, as I told you, surveys for Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Uruguay. Their quality is not not the best. Some of the surveys are nationally representative, not all of them. In the case of Colombia, for instance, it's only Bogota, and last year's Bogota, Cali, and Medellin. But sometimes they only target urban households, sometimes only households in some cities. So they are tricky, but they are the best we have to study the whole of the wealth distribution for now. So basically, if you take these four, these are the Gini indices that you have. Very high also, around 0.7 for Chile, 0.8, and going up to 0.9 in the case of Colombia. So a very, very, very large increase in wealth inequality according to the surveys. In Colombia, 10 points of the Gini index. That is massive. So that tells you that there may be some problems with the survey, but we don't know. For the case of Mexico and Uruguay, we only have 1 point for each. 2013 for Uruguay, 2019 for Mexico. So, and basically the same happens with the top 10%. The ranking is the same, the top 10% are Gini, and also the trends for Colombia and Mexico. What we can say based on these surveys is that at least we can say that wealth inequality is very high. If you have a Gini index of 0.7 or higher, that points at extremely high inequality. Think that we have to, a Gini index of income inequality is around what in Latin America, 0.4, 0.45, 0.5. This is much higher. So that points at something that we expected, that is that wealth inequality is much higher than income inequality, but this is reassuring in a sense that it confirms what you would expect. The other interesting thing is that when you look at the bottom of the distribution, especially the bottom 50% of the distribution, and this is something to take into account when you think about wealth inequality. The bottom half of the distribution has no wealth. Actually, in the case of Colombia, it has negative wealth. It has something around 0 to 5% of total wealth, the bottom 50% of population. This is not strange. This happens all over the world. Usually the bottom half has no wealth whatsoever, or a very negligible amount of wealth, of the share of the wealth of the country. So in a sense, it's like when you think about the distribution of wealth, it's like the whole distribution has moved to the right, and it's like it starts at the median of the distribution, and it's very concentrated to the top. So it's very different from an income distribution. I insist, it starts in the median, and it is very skewed, and it's highly concentrated at the top. So you can say, if you're asked, what is the level of wealth inequality in Latin America, I'll say, well, for the countries that we have some data, we can say that with some degree of confidence, that the bottom 50 has almost nothing, and that the top 1% has around 40% of total wealth. And that is something that you can say with a certain amount of confidence, right? Again, this points at an extreme concentration of assets in these economies. Any questions? But, and this is when something that we have to consider, and this is when our aggregate wealth estimates are useful. Consider that the amount of
you have about 10 minutes. I don't know. I'm
yeah.
sorry, because students may have other classes. Otherwise,
I will wrap up in 2 minutes. This is just to say that if you compare the aggregate amount of wealth in these surveys with the aggregate wealth that we know from national accounts or by our estimates, usually we only have something like 40% of the wealth that households are supposed to have, right? So we have to know that all of these estimates are based on 40% of the wealth that they are supposed to be capturing. And this is one of the explanations, I'm going to go to upwards. This is one of the explanations why the top 1% share is so much lower than in admin data, because you are missing a lot of wealth in these estimates, and especially because the missing wealth is especially concentrated in financial wealth, which surveys do not capture well at all. They usually capture like 10, 15, 20% of financial wealth, which is the wealth that the top 1% mostly has. So you are heavily underestimating the wealth, the aggregate wealth, and the wealth of the top 1%. And that's basically the explanation why these surveys are not very useful to think about the top of distribution, but they are useful for thinking about the bottom when there's no financial wealth anyway. And finally, just I'm going to say this in 1 minute. There's something else that you can do with all this data. You can also look at variance from not from the top, but for the very, very, very top of the distribution, not the top 1%, but the top 0.0001% of the distribution, which is taking the data, the Forbes billionaires list data. And this is a number of things that you can do. You can at least count the number of billionaires in each country or the share of billionaires in some of these countries to see if they are increasing or not, because that gives you a sense of what may be going on at the top of the distribution. This is a number of things that we do here. You can check them in the paper. Something that I find interesting is that this is in panel A, the Latin America's billionaires. This should say 1988, 2020. This is their average net worth as compared to the net worth of the billionaires elsewhere. And this is the number of billionaires. I'm sorry, the share of individuals of billionaires as a share of the population, and the share of their wealth as a share of the total wealth of the economy. And especially here, what you find is that Latin American billionaires are not doing worse than the rest of the world. Actually, their average wealth is close, on average, insist, to the wealth of the billionaires elsewhere, right? So we have proper billionaires in the region, which is a same amount of wealth on average than what you have in the rest of the world. Of course, you have massive amount of billionaires in the US, in Europe. But on average, our billionaires are just as rich as the rest. And yeah, so this is what you can do with this data, which is very fun actually, because you see the names of these people, which is something that you don't see when you have survey or admin data. And this is a bonus. This is not for the paper, but something else that we've been working on. Nora knows this paper. This is a paper of wealth to simulate how much revenue and what are the distributional consequences of a wealth tax in Latin America. But what is interesting here is that here we try to combine surveys and Forbes billionaires data for some countries. And what you find is that when you combine these data sources, sometimes you do get estimates that are close to what admin data says that you are supposed to have. So something close to 40% share of the top 1%. So there is room to think that we may be able to combine these data sources in the future, especially provided we have more surveys that we can use. So just to wrap up, what we know is that wealth inequality is very high in the region, at least in the countries where we can measure it. There's a lot of countries that we don't know anything about, but for the countries for which we do have information, that's what we know. Data is scarce. Data are scarce. I'm sorry, I'll correct that. But it's growing, and there's a lot of room to move forward here. So this is a call to all of you who are maybe thinking about doing research. There's a lot to do here because we know nothing about these things. So if you are interested in studying wealth inequality, there's a lot of things that we and you can do. Combining different data sources is tempting because we have very few data points, but it's probably risky at this point still. So you should be very careful. It seems like there's no other way around. We need more data, and especially we need more surveys. It's like we are in the prehistory of inequality studies when it comes to wealth. It's like kind of the same situation that I guess researchers had in the 1970s to 1980s when there were only a few household surveys and some data from national accounts. it's kind of the same now with wealth. So the main takeaway is that I highly recommend you to be very careful when you use wealth inequality data, but also to invite you to join us and do more research on these things, because they are important and there's a lot to be done. So Nora, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mauricio. I don't know if anybody has a question, or if they do later. I mean, I think we can share them with you. If they send them to us, we could forward you their questions. But is there anybody who has a quick question? Because I do. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you if you could say, I mean, if someone asks you, okay, so what is broadly the level of wealth inequality in Latin America today, and has it been going up or down or stayed the same? Would you be hesitant about answering, or do you have an answer?
I would say two things. I'd say that we are pretty confident that the top 1% has something like 40% of aggregate wealth, and that the bottom 50 has 0 to 5% of aggregate wealth. I think that's something that we can say.
In practically all countries.
Yeah, and for the few countries for which we have data, but this is probably the case for the rest. But I would be cautious, but I would say that. And I would also say that evidence seems to indicate that the very long trends, the long-term trends on wealth inequality, at least point at the fact that the wealth inequality in the 19th century was not higher than what it is now. So maybe there was a point in history in the past century where it declined and then it went up again. Maybe it stayed the same, basically the same as with income. But we don't know if there was a great leveling or not. With wealth inequality, we know even less. But I would say that at least we are confident, or kind of confident, that the level of wealth inequality is not higher now than it was in the 19th century, or the other way around either. I would say those two things, which I know is not very.
No, but
it's not what I would like to say. I would like to be able to say more things, but I think that our main point in this paper is that we need more data, and we should be very cautious, because there is a lot of estimates around. There are a lot of estimates around, and I don't know if we can fully trust them yet.
yeah, a sort of similar message to our lecture, my lecture last week, that you have to be cautious. I don't know, Ludovico, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mauricio. Fascinating. It's really interesting to see researchers like you devoted to cracking this very difficult nut, because it's very important. You started out by pointing out the relationship between economic power and political power, a point that we touched upon also earlier in the course. And so I think even more than income concentration, wealth concentration can be very telling in terms of its influence in the political system. So
Okay, so I guess we
thank
have
you
to
for
go.
illuminating us.
It's 1:16, so we should let the students go to their other classes. Mauricio, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we'll post your PowerPoint on the website for the students, and we'll share the recording with you. And this recording, Ludovico, I don't know if we will be, I think we can also upload it in the webinar series, because it's just a Zoom recording, I imagine.